Welcome to this edition of the Talk of Simsbury. My name is Dominique Avery. Today we're going to focus on the 2015 legislative session, which officially starts on January 7th. Joining me for this discussion, as they did last year, are our local legislators. We've got John Hampton here, State Representative, and State Senator Kevin Witkos, who both won re-election in November. Witkos to his fourth Senate term and Hampton to his second House term. Also back with us today is Hartford Courant State Capitol Bureau Chief Chris Keating, who happens to be a Simsbury resident. Welcome. I'm so glad all of you are here again.
Thanks for having us. Thank you very much.
I think the last time we were here, we were talking about glass eels. And the day we talked about it, it was vetoed. So.
Doesn't get more glamorous than that.
Yes, yeah, glass eels, very glamorous. Chris, I'm going to start with you. Since this show is called The Talk of Simsbury, I think what's most important to the residents of the town is the state budget and what it's going to mean for us. We've heard now that there's going to be a $1.3 billion deficit looming over the state next year. And for the last 4 years, cities and towns were basically held harmless by the governor. We didn't really see a decrease in state funding. But now I'm going to ask you to put your future-looking cap on and ask how you would advise our Board of Finance to prepare for the budget this year.
Well, I would think one thing always to keep in mind, Governor Malloy was a mayor of Stamford for 14 years. So one of the fairly high things on his list was to avoid any decreases in aid to the cities and towns. It may be a new philosophy. In other words, be happy with what you have right now. In other words, certainly don't expect a 10% increase or a 20% increase. In other words, be happy with what you have now. It's hard exactly to say, but the governor's kind of stuck his neck out. In other words, if he cut a lot of money to cities and towns, first of all, I don't really think the legislature would go along with it because 169 towns, they all have legislators and senators, and they would pretty much be apt to vote against it. So I would pretty much be leaning towards flat funding. That's obviously a guess. Ben Barnes has not told me that. He's the budget director. But based on the many, many public statements by the governor of holding them harmless or at least, not going backwards, I think if you're gonna see cuts, I think it'll be in other areas.
You just brought up Ben Barnes. Given the budget pressures that the governor's facing, many people have been shocked recently by by the raises the Governor Malloy gave to his staff, including Ben Barnes, a very healthy raise. And we just read in the paper that the Yukon president, Susan Herbst, got a huge raise. John, you're a Democrat. You're also fiscally conservative. What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us on the program. And it's great to be with Chris and Senator Witkos, and we're excited to be working together in the new year. A lot going on. But to your question, I think that that does send a bad message. Pay increases, especially the University of Connecticut president. It sends a bad message that we are not keeping our financial house in order, and certainly our residents aren't getting those increases, and our seniors, and I think it's not a great way to start out our year, because first and foremost, I think for both of us, it's the economy and the state of the economy, and we're certainly not out of the woods.
Kevin, to stay with sort of the education theme, Susan Herbst, you're now ranking member on the Higher Education Committee. Congratulations.
Thank you.
This year, in the last few months, there have been a number of missteps, as far as I can see, in higher education in our system, and increases in salaries for Board of Regents people who left with sort of mysterious money following them. I'm not exactly sure what's happened. And then there was a very large contract, a $2 million contract given to a Boston firm to redesign the system. What's going on here?
Well, I think the entire system needs a top-to-bottom review, and that's why I actually asked to serve on the Higher Education Committee. I think it's been running nilly-willy and kind of free-flowing without too much oversight, and the folks that are responsible are changing hands left and right, so there's no continuum to see what's happening in the system. So I asked to serve on that committee. As far as Susan Herbst goes, it was reported that she did receive a 17%, I think, a wage increase. Not all of that is at taxpayer expense. $300,000 of her raise is paid by the Yukon Foundation, which is private donations, and that's just to bring her up to the level of what university presidents the size of Yukon make. So I just saw that in the paper today, so I'll be examining that a little bit further. But from the hiring of Dr. Gray at the Board of Regents, right on through with the university professors dangling a vote of no confidence against them, that's troubling as tuition rates are skyrocketing. So I think we've got to really get in there and do an analysis and try to set the stage right. But the timing for the governor's announcement of raises couldn't be worse. We're going into a new year. We're in a deficit mode this year. We're looking at a $3 billion deficit next year. And the CBAC, all the state employee bargaining units are up for renegotiation again this year. So how do you go in as a bargaining chip saying, I just gave my administrative heads anywhere from 3% to 12%, and the highest paid are getting the 12% raises?
Chris, were you surprised when?
Well, the amount, yes, where the 12% came from, you're right, they calculated in their own heads 3% a year times 4 years equals 12%.
Because they hadn't had an increase.
Right, if somebody hadn't had one in 4 years. But as John was saying, I think my memory is the Social Security increases, I believe, 1.7% for 2015. I believe that was right. You mentioned the seniors. So yes, it was announced on December 23rd, I guess, at 4:30, the day before Christmas Eve. John Lender from The Current wrote about that quite a bit. So no, the answer is we had not been given a heads up on that, or I don't think anybody had. It really was not discussed during the campaign between Foley and Malloy. It really never came up. It was kind of out of the blue. I'm sure it was probably percolating behind the scenes, but as far as a public notice, we had not been notified about that. And again, it was clearly not a campaign issue, really, certainly not in the governor's campaign, because I was in the trenches on that one, and it didn't come up.
I don't think anybody expected it to happen.
Right.
Not in this economy, to give this kind of raises.
On behalf of the people who work for the governor, I've observed the governor fairly closely, and I know he makes people work really hard for him and keep awful hours, but I agree that it does send sort of a
Yeah, I
very
don't think any of us are
unfortunate.
speaking to the merits of the staff. I
Right.
mean, all of them that I know and work with certainly are hardworking people, but I think it's the timing and the rate of increase is pretty dramatic.
So just a general question for the two of you. As you approach the session, we're recording this on December 30th. It will air for the entire month of January after the ceremonial first day is over. Each one of you, I'd like you to talk about what is your major issue that you're looking at. John, you want to start?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm just so excited to be returning for a second term, and it's an honor and thrill to be going back. And of course, opening day is, as you know, Kevin, it's an exciting day and a lot of pomp and circumstance, but there'll be a interesting new dynamic at the Capitol with a lot of new faces in leadership positions and chairmanships, and of course in the House the Republicans picked up 10 seats, so there'll be a new dynamic and even more of a call to work in a bipartisan way toward the budget, as I said earlier, and the economy and how we address some of the looming issues. Transportation will be a big theme this year. You'll see with the governor and the speaker and the leadership and making decisions on tolls versus no tolls. And I'm not a big advocate on the whole toll system. I think we're making it harder and harder for anybody to come into Connecticut to do business, to live, to play, and the notion that we might add a toll to make it harder for people to come to Connecticut.
And yet there's the issue of people driving through our state buying
I know,
gas,
I know.
waiting to Massachusetts or buying gas in Massachusetts because the gas taxes are lower, but our gas tax isn't making enough money right now.
But I just still feel that and over again, I heard this throughout the campaign and still hear from constituents that it's hard to survive in this state and to entice anybody to come here to live and work or retire. So I don't think it's the best way to start out. I'd rather look at other cost saving, looking at our bonding policy perhaps in terms of tweaking some of our expenditures there.
And yet, I'm gonna not give you a chance to give your top issue, but didn't the governor say something? Didn't I hear something about bonding some of the transportation things that he wants to do, which would mean more borrowing?
Some of that has happened, yeah. Well, there's a lot of things have been bounced around through the years on the whole bonding thing. It's hard sometimes to nail that down because through the years, probably the state has done it every which way. They sometimes say they're bonding for operating expenses. Money gets moved around actually quite a bit. I've been there, I guess, maybe for quite a while, so I've seen every iteration of it. Some of the Department of Motor Vehicles is getting funded by the Special Transportation Fund, then they switch it back. Right. So as far as predicting exactly what will happen with that, I'm not quite sure on that. But tolls, just in general, is a very high-profile issue. And it comes up quite a bit. But the difference would be if the governor does take the full force of his office and push towards it, that would be a game changer in that. The most recent that we've talked about in tolls was kind of the Route 11 in southeastern Connecticut. That, in other words, we will complete that road if you put a toll on it. The bottom line is it's still not completed and there is no toll on it. So, but the difference would be if the governor came out with the force of his office, any governor, but in this case a Democratic governor with a Democratic legislature, would make it a much more high-profile issue and give it a much better chance of happening. It's a little hard to say exactly what would happen at this moment, but it would change it quite a bit.
And then he would agree to lockbox it, theoretically. That was if that's being talked about.
Well, we've talked about a new tolling program that is offered through the federal government, where as long as you maintain the same number of untolled lanes as tolled lanes, you don't have to pay back any of the money that you've gotten for the previous years. Analysis shows that there will be more revenue generated through the tolling than just what you're getting now in federal dollars. And the last thing is the federal government will audit that money, so it cannot be used for anything other than transportation purposes. Otherwise, you'll lose the funding, and you have to pay it all back. So for Connecticut, that's a great incentive to say you can't move it around to other things other than transportation project, which has been the problem here in the state of Connecticut. And as a Republican, we'd like to see it tied to a reduction in our gas tax. So if we agree to tolls, then we want to see a reduction in Connecticut's gas tax to benefit Connecticut consumers that use our roads, but allow other people that travel on our roadways to help pay for the cost of maintenance. And not just the roads, but Metro North, we saw how many times the commuters that down along the shoreline or Fairfield County commute to New York City with the hour delays that they've had, the bridges broken. Those monies can be used for that as well. So it's much needed right here in our backyard. The I-84 viaduct is coming up to its useful age. It's aging out, and that's going to have to be replaced. They have billions of dollars. How are we going to pay for that? So we've got to really start looking long term at some of the solutions. But we should get something for that solution as well.
Interesting. Well, I think probably sounds like it will be an issue this year.
Yeah, I think it will definitely be an issue. And on any of these things, I've always been a believer on the real big projects. You need a governor behind it. In other words, if you want to build Rentschler Field, Roland was behind it. If you want to build a convention center in Hartford, Roland was behind it. In other words, something that is just of that immensity. You really need a governor, regardless of what party they're in, to push something of that size. And tolls is a big issue. So in other words, if the governor remained silent or did nothing, it wouldn't happen. I don't think it would happen.
The busway wouldn't have happened if Governor Malloy wasn't behind it.
Yeah,
that's a prime example, as Chris was saying.
Right.
And our ailing infrastructure is a key
and everybody
issue.
knows that, right?
Yeah.
So there have been a lot of changes this year at the state capitol, especially in the Senate. Chris, you did an interesting interview with Martin Looney, who's going to be the new Senate president. And I'm wondering, Kevin, what you think of Looney and how different it's going to be and how you found working with him in the past, because Looney's been at the Capitol for many, many years.
Well, I've served with Marty now for 6 years in the Senate, and he's newly elected to the Senate President Pro Tem. how we sit in the Senate, unlike the House, we sit according to our districts, not by party designation. So Marty sits 2 chairs down from me, so we've had the opportunity to speak a lot of personal things about just different pieces of legislation that isn't aired on the Senate floor. And I think Marty advocates very hard for his constituency down in New Haven. And I think that drives a lot of his policies and initiatives that Marty believes that the state could do more to affect a better change of life for people, that the state sometimes should be the driver where...
Okay, he's more progressive in
Yeah,
that.
and where we may say, well, let's create an environment and let people better themselves off by their own initiative. So I think that's going to be changed, but Len Fasano is known as the new Republican leader, and the two of them have been friends for a very long time, so that changes the dichotomy a lot in the chamber.
They're both from New Haven, and they're both
from New
attorneys.
Haven. We
They've worked
kidded around. You
together.
guys could, if you really want to save the state some money, you can commute together and save on the mileage. So I mean, it remains to be seen. We'll see. So far, we've had some meetings with each other to talk about how we want to progress in the next session, and it's been so far so good.
So do you think that Marty Looney's style will be very different than Don Williams' style Chris, what do you think?
Well, Marty Looney is not a bomb thrower. He's a. There are other people who are maybe they're more quotable, and he is somewhat of a consensus builder. Kevin is right. In other words, though, Marty is a very strong Democrat who always votes for gun control and has voted for many tax increases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he is still a bit of a people person, and he gets along with Joe Markley, who's one of the more conservative members of your caucus. So he's not, but he will not, I don't get the impression that he would try to muscle things through the legislature. What I meant by consensus builder, I don't mean that, every vote's going to be 36-0 in the Senate, but he will not, I don't think, he will not unnecessarily antagonize the Republicans just for the sport of it, which sometimes happens at the Capitol. I don't think Looney acts that way. He's not bombastic. And so people should be able to get along, but, when the smoke clears, there probably will be a lot of votes that on principle and on political lines will still be split. Will still be split on taxes and any number of things. But Marty Looney is not the kind of guy who would prompt acrimony. That's just not really his style.
So Kevin, are we going to see a lot of amendments to sort of controversial bills where you're going to be talking in the middle of the night and keeping everybody who works at the legislature up? And there's a lot of
I tell you, we'd like to do a rule change that no legislating after midnight.
Yeah.
And
I heard that bill was introduced, was filed already.
We did pretty good last year. I think it was only a couple nights. Unlike the House, you guys were a few late nights. But in the Senate, we had some older members, and I think people are respectful of the age, and people have to drive home.
Drive
and,
far.
We're lucky here in the Farmington Valley. It's a 20-minute ride to the state capitol, where some folks have an hour and a half, 2-hour ride, and
it's not safe.
Driving at 1 o'clock in the morning after you've been in the Capitol since 10 a.m. that previous morning is a long day.
Yeah.
And dedication. So. There may be amendments. We'll have to see what happens. That remains to be seen.
Read my lips. No new amendments, right?
So I never asked you, I never got around to you for your number one issue that you're going to be tracking and pushing this year.
Well, I think part of my initiatives this year are going to be on my campaign promises, and that was to make Connecticut a better place to live, work, and to raise a family. So kind of that's driving a lot of the initiatives. One of the ones that a bill I just put in just recently, last week as a matter of fact, was the fact that some of the state agencies are making policy changes which affect municipalities in a costly way, another unfunded mandate. And there's no protection for the municipalities, and the legislature isn't looking at those things. They're being arbitrarily done. And so I've introduced the bill that says if it does require an unfunded mandate to the municipalities, it has to go before the Regulations Review Committee to have some oversight.
And now you're on Regulations Review.
I made sure I'm on the Regulations Review Committee because
very clever.
It's very simplistic, like the wastewater MS4 wastewater permitting.
Of the issue that's just come up.
That just bubbled up, but there's another one that just came out regarding Marshall Mix. It's the type of asphalt that's put on town roads. The DOT wasn't going to include it in their pricing this year. Just arbitrarily, they didn't want to do that. And so that's a huge cost of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to municipalities. And the DOT wouldn't give a reason why. So I've been urging them, they relented, and they said, this year we'll include it again, but we don't know what we're going to do going forward. And that's an unchecked means of the government, just who knows why they did it, and nobody will say why. So I said, well, I want to make sure there's some protections built in for the municipalities. At least the legislature has some checks and balances. We may agree with the department, say, yep, it's a good thing, go ahead. But we also don't want to micromanage. So unless the trigger would be a cost to municipalities that's unfunded.
So I wanted to take 1 minute. I mean, a year ago we did sort of a legislative preview and teaching people who are watching how the legislature works. We never talked about the Regulation Review Committee. It's very mysterious. Chris, do you know anything about it? Can you describe it briefly?
Well, it might not be as high profile as judiciary, and it might not as appropriations and finance, but people like Art O'Neill have been on it in the past. Very, very often it's people who are veteran legislators who know how the system works, and it is actually very important. Do we write about it as much as we should? Probably not. But it's usually people who know, how the levers work, who get on that. And a person like Art O'Neill is kind of the House Dean, and he's been there forever. It is quite important. And sometimes it's on issues that are important that might not immediately be in the headlines. Obviously, not something like tolls and the things we've been discussing here, but important things that affect the cities and towns or the whole state government. Sometimes it gets overlooked. And that's one of the things at the Capitol. Sometimes important things can happen that get a little bit overlooked.
Well, medical marijuana, solar, wind, those are some of the most recent controversial things that the Regulations Review Committee, the legislature will come up with a law and say, allow it, but then the department has to draft how they're going to implement it, and then it has to be approved by the Regulations Review Committee.
And that's when the Regulation Review Committee
comes in. That's the nitty-gritty behind it, yeah.
Are they completely bipartisan?
Yeah, it's a bipartisan,
half and half,
and they meet year-round.
Who are the new chairs this year? Trying to remember.
Well, one chair is no longer there. It was going to be Senator Ayala, was going to be the ranking member.
DMV.
But Clark Chapin, the Republican, is the Senate chair.
Mary Mashinsky was chair.
And I
She's
think,
program review.
yeah, I don't know who the House chair is, because it's usually the Senate chair is Republican one year, and that year the House Democrats have the chairmanship.
At this
so.
late date, the House has not even handed out its
I
assignments
asked John what his
yet.
committee assignments were, and he says he doesn't know yet.
John doesn't know
I
yet.
hope to know soon
Well, by the time this airs, John will know.
where to go.
So when I asked you your major issues, I wanted to put in my 2 cents because my number one issue is professionalizing voting in the state and putting pressure on the Secretary of State's office to allow electronic transmission of vote totals so that they don't have to be hand transcribed and faxed to the state. And that's an issue to our Registrar of Voters here in Simsbury. You raised the issue also about the number of primary places that have to be open in small towns. And I want to know how somebody can go about putting pressure on the Secretary of State to get her to accept electronically transmitted votes. What do we do? That's really important to the Registrar of Voters in Simsbury.
Sure, and we'll be talking more, I'm sure, to both of them about the issue and
Well, it's in statute, so number one, we have to change the statute. But the other thing is that I think we have to look at is the Secretary of State had put forward a ballot proposal, which was defeated, which was going to allow the legislature to come up with on their own changes to how elections will take place in Connecticut. And the electorate said, we're not going to give you that power. It's going to stay within the Constitution. So I think that's one of the things that me personally would be nervous about changing election laws, because the people have spoken saying, well, we don't want the legislature tinkering. I know that's a reporting, but different. But definitely has to have a public hearing, because sometimes bills go through the legislature without a public hearing.
Well, this particular issue has had multiple public hearings, and the Registrar of Voters do support this, but it's my impression that Denise Merrill has been cautioned by people in the computer field, saying that they can't trust electronically transmitted votes. But wouldn't you like to know? I wanted to know how Simsbury voted on Election Day, and I couldn't find out till the next day.
Yeah.
That's when we have to rely on people like Chris to help us to put pressure on government officials to say, give us a legitimate reason why in today's age of technology you won't allow an email or however it's encoded or security that it's factual from this person.
It doesn't even
Like for
have
the
to be.
military.
Yeah, and
It
followed up
doesn't
by
even
phone
have to
call.
be official, right? I mean, the official thing can still be faxed or brought in the next day by the state
Right.
police or whatever. It doesn't have to be there till, but just approximate unofficial votes, shouldn't they be?
You know who the president is of the United States before you find out who wins
Exactly.
an local election in Connecticut.
that's true.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very much of a very high-speed, high-tech world. People have iPhones and iPads and all this kind of stuff. And my impression is very much the voting system is not that way. In other words, the people involved in it, and there's nothing wrong with older people, but a lot of the people involved in the voting system are older, and everything about it is done the way that we were doing voting in 1978 or maybe 88, whatever. And people have, certainly the younger people, and most people, as I said, iPhones, iPads, instantaneous. A very fast-moving world, fast-moving technological world, and Connecticut's voting system hasn't really dovetailed with that fast-moving technological world. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this, and
Right.
everything would be sent by email, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it just doesn't work as fast as the rest of the world works.
Right. And
At the
that's-
moment.
And that, land of steady habits. I mean, these habits are a little too steady for my, for my preference. We have a couple more minutes. Swearing in, the first day of session, it's a pretty exciting day.
It is.
You get sworn in the Senate all together, right?
All together.
And you get sworn in the House all together.
Yes, at 10:30.
And this year, it's completely different because we have our governor's been
Sure.
reelected, and he's going to be inaugurated again, and so it's a pretty exciting day.
There's a parade and
Inaugural ball and,
it's neat. What a lot of people will see for the first time is the construction of the Connecticut Veterans War Memorial right out in the front of the plaza on the Legislative Office Building. I was here today, and they're feverishly still pouring cement to try to get everything ready for opening day. So it's going to be
really?
beautiful
I
and what
was
a tribute to
there
the
last
veterans
week, yeah.
on opening day.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming in and giving
You're
us
welcome.
a
Thank you.
sort of a preview, and for our viewers, this will be airing after opening day, but all the things that we discussed are not even going to come up in the first month. The first month is sort of very pro forma. A lot of bills are introduced. Thanks to everyone here at SCTV for getting the show on the air. Thanks to my guests already. And finally, thank you for joining us. If you missed any portion of the show, you can find it on our website at simsburytv.org. You can access information about the General Assembly at cga.ct.gov. And you can find Chris Keating's reporting in the Hartford Courant, both in the newspaper version and online. I'm Dominique Avery. See you next time for the Talk of Simsbury.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.